How did we get here? You ever think about that much? I probably think about it more than I ought to. It's probably why I like studying the Bible and teaching it so much. Because, yeah, I do ask those kinds of questions all the time. How did we get here? Why? And then after we figure out how did we get here, why are we here? This is such an amazing, complex, extraordinary thing. Just the idea of existence itself is it's really the great mystery of everything. Existence. How? Why? Um, the amazing thing about the Bible is it doesn't just claim to answer these questions, it hits the ground running right away. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. Let's take a look at it, beginning in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, and we're going to take a look at the entire verse today. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The question I want us to look at today, though, is okay, what exactly did God create? The heavens means the universe, everything. So God created the universe and the earth within it. But what exactly is included in that? It never really was a big thought about mine until actually a few years ago. I found Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time at the local library, and it was a very thin book. So I thought, oh, I'll read it and catch up with one of the smartest guys who ever lived. And about chapter 3, my brain stopped working. Wow, it's unbelievable. But the best I got from the book, and I did finish it eventually, and from further study and so on, is that recent science has confirmed through Einstein's theory of relativity and through quantum physics, which interestingly are two different theories that explain two different things. Einstein's theory of relativity explains big things, astronomy, and quantum physics explains the very, very smallest things, submicroscopic stuff. And weirdly enough, the theories don't agree with each other. So right now in science, the big holy grail is what they call the unified field theory, one theory that explains everything. Right now, there are two theories that explain the very large and the very small, and they don't agree. It's as best I understand it. If you're a scientist and you understand it better than that, I will yield the floor, but that's the best I can understand what we've got going on here. But anyway, from what we best understand about physics, with some amazing smart people figuring some things out that hurt all of our brains, is that there are, I'm going to look at it this way. There are three essential truths that I've discovered about God and time. And I'm not the one who discovered them. I'm the one who, other people have discovered them and I've read up on them. Here are the three essential truths about God and time, and they go into what did God create when he created everything. And the first one is this: both space and time were created by God. The first person to actually propose this, believe it or not, was not Hawking, was not Einstein, was not even Isaac Newton. You got to go back to the late 300s and early 400s AD to St. Augustine, sometimes called Augustine. And he proposed that time, in addition to matter, was created by God. He was thought to be crazy then. He was thought to be crazy for centuries. But this is now a well accepted scientific fact. And we have to recognize that this well accepted scientific fact that both matter and time were created at the same time, that there was a time when time didn't exist. Brain hurting yet? Yeah, I know. This now fully accepted theory was not first proposed by a scientist, but was proposed by a Bible scholar. So when I say good theology and good science are good friends, this is where some of the root of that comes from. But science has really only caught up with St. Augustine in very, very recent history. If you're my age, I'm 60. If you're my age, you may remember back in the 70s or so on, there was a TV show on PBS called Cosmos. And the host of it was a guy named Karl, a really brilliant guy. And he used to begin his show saying that the cosmos, the universe, is all that ever was, all that ever will be. And the premise in the founding words of the show were that basically the idea that the universe is pre-existent, that has always existed and it will always exist. So within my lifetime, the fundamental presupposition of whether or not the universe has always existed has changed. That's how recent it is. But it was proposed by St. Augustine, a Bible scholar, in late AD 300s and early AD 400s. So you remember that it actually happens a lot, that Bible scholars discover things that science later stumbles upon and goes, oh yeah, I guess that is true. What we've really recently discovered is that time is an entity, like matter, that it came into existence, and that the two came into existence at the same moment, because one cannot exist without the other. You cannot have matter without time. You cannot have time without matter. As best I can explain it, without completely frying my brain, is this. Name a unit of time. Okay. Let's pick a minute. Okay. A minute is a unit of time, or an hour, right? A minute is a unit of time. So what is a minute? A minute is 1/60th of an hour, right? Okay. And what is an hour? An hour is 1/24th of a day, right? Okay. What is a day? A day is how long it takes the earth to spin on its axis. A day is a measurement of movement in matter, in space and time. What's a year? A year is how long it takes the earth to rotate around the sun. Every time stamp we have, aside from a week, which God gave us, which we'll see in the next couple of weeks, every time stamp we have is based on the motion of the material world. A month is based on the rotation of the moon around the earth, right? It's all about motion. Time is about the physical moving of matter. So if all of the material universe stopped moving all of a sudden, time would stop moving, because time is based on the movement of the material world. Yeah, I know. I'm I'm going to do that a lot in this session, because it's challenging. It's not the way we usually think, but science backs that up. That when God created, He created both space and time at the same time. So both space and time were created by God, which means God exists above and beyond space and time. If you created it, you are greater than it. So God is not like a being that existed way, way, way back into the eons of time and at some point came into existence. God created the idea of time itself and created the physical nature of time itself when He created the material world, because one requires the other. So if God made the material world, He also made the construct of time. But since God is not physical, then He's not limited by the constraints of time, because time and physical space require each other for each other's existence. So God living outside of time and space is not limited by time or space. Again, trying to explain this, trying to understand it is really challenging. The best way I can see it, and it's really inadequate, is the way someone writes a novel or shoots a movie. I've written 4 books now. Yeah, I know. Not bragging, just to tell you that I know some of this. I have never yet written a book starting at the beginning and then stopping at the end. You write it in bits and pieces. You write a portion you think is going to be the beginning, it ends up being the middle. You write a part you think is going to be the end, that ends up being the beginning. And you move it around. Same thing when people write novels, same thing when people shoot movies. Almost no movies are shot in sequence from the beginning, from the first shot to the last shot. They're shot in bits and pieces. And even if they have a general idea of how it's going to lay out, until it's actually presented at the movie theater or until you buy the book, the bits and pieces move around. Now, the best I can come up with, and it's really not a great illustration, but it's the best I've got, is that God is like the author of the novel or the director of the movie. And until the movie is done and it's presented, and we are now living in the presentation of the movie, we are now living in the in the novel that has been written. So it's not going to change now. But because God created time and space, like the writer of a novel can get to the end of the novel and go, oops, I painted myself in a corner. That guy can't do that because at the beginning he did this. The writer of the novel can go back to the beginning and change the beginning so that it matches the end, right? That's what God did or can do or is doing because it started again. Wow, right? Brain hurt. God, when he started the clock in Genesis 1, knew what was going to happen in Revelation 21 because he's the author of it. He started space and time. He knows the whole thing. So we don't have to worry that God is going to be surprised and that at the end, the devil is going to pull a trick that God didn't see coming. The novel's been written. It's in your hands. The movie's been shot. We're watching it on a screen. We who are participating in the middle of it don't have some uncertainty and some fear about how it's going to end because we haven't been there yet, but God is because he wrote it. Now, again, it's not perfect because that if we look at it too much that way, then it erases free will and we don't have a choice. So maybe it's God putting together a reality series where we get to behave in certain ways and then he edits it at the end. I don't know. Again, right? None of this is perfect, but it's the best approach I've got to understand these first two principles, that space and time were created by God and that God exists outside of space and time because he is not a material being. So he's not subject to the laws of time and space. He can move around between things. So when we say, God knows what we're going to say before we say it, he does. But we do still have the free will to say what we say. Again, hard stuff to really pull together. And that's not because it's wrong, but that's because our understanding of it is limited. And this then goes to the third point about space and time, which is this: the past, present, and future are all the same to God. Just like the author can rearrange and rewrite, the idea that Revelation 21 hasn't happened yet is not a problem for God. And this is essential knowledge for us reading the scripture, because just as if you go through the Old Testament, you see a bunch of prophecies about Jesus and you see a bunch of them fulfilled by Jesus' first coming, we know that the rest will be fulfilled by Jesus' second coming, and the prophecies about his second coming in the New Testament will be fulfilled. And we don't have to worry about them because past, present, and future are all the same to God. He wrote the novel. He directed the movie. We're in the middle of it, playing it out and seeing how it happens. Now, again, that is not perfect. There's a bunch of holes in that metaphor that I gave you, but it's the closest I can come to an explanation of space, time, beginning, the end, and God being above all of it. And that's the nature of the conversation that anybody has. People who are atheists run into these snags too. So it's not like, oh, the Bible doesn't have a great story because you can't even explain it. No, the atheist doesn't have a better answer than this either. In fact, the atheist is missing a bunch of points because of their lack of accepting that there could be a God in the middle of all this. But we all run into the same kind of that's the best I can do right now kind of thing because of the size of these questions. So that's okay. Now let's take a look, shift a little bit from this and look at two questions. Isn't evolution a scientific fact? And two, is biblical creation scientifically possible? Because if we're talking about everything being created, and if good science and good theology are good friends, and if science is coming up with a theory of evolution that appears at times to contradict the Bible, how do we reconcile the two of them? So we're going to get into another messy part of it too, but we're going to tackle it because that's the book we're in. Okay. We're not afraid of looking at hard questions. We're not. Okay. So let's take a look at the first of these two questions. Isn't evolution a scientific fact? Isn't a Christian opposing evolution the same as opposing gravity? That's how it's presented. Oh, you don't believe in evolution? Oh, you don't believe in gravity? Or you're just going to give up your iPhone because you don't believe in science? No. This is not a case of the Bible being anti-science. Good science and good theology are good friends. But we're going to look at this in a couple different ways. First of all, let's take a look at the issue of what's called microevolution and macroevolution. Because a lot of what evolutionists will say when they look at the creation story and when they look at us as believing in God and in the version of creation that the Bible gives us is, well, take a look at, we know evolution is true because take a look at the changes in moths and bacteria that we have observed within our lifetime. And to a certain extent, I have to agree. Microevolution happens all around us. And what is microevolution? Microevolution involves small changes within species, also known as adaptation. So yes, we can observe how germs mutate to fight antibiotics and viruses. We can understand and see within the scope of human history how light-skinned people originate from areas where it's cold and darker-skinned people originate from areas where it's typically warm. And we can understand why those adaptations happen because of the climate and because of the diet and because of all kinds of other things. We can see that. We can see that in my era, all you have to do is visit like Colonial Williamsburg back east and take a look at the height of their doors and the size of their beds. They're much smaller than ours. Why? Because within just a few generations, just a few hundred years, people have gotten bigger. Because of science, because of nutrition, because of exercise, because of our understanding of all of those things, we are adapting to our environment, and we can grow larger now. That's microevolution, or also what's called adaptation. What we don't see, however, is any proof of one type of species becoming a different type of species, of a bird becoming a fish or a fish becoming a bird. And the Bible tells us in several places, we'll see it next week as we go through the rest of Genesis 1, that it says they reproduce, quote, according to their kind, close quote. In other words, apples produce apple trees. They can produce different types of apple trees, and there can be variations within apple trees, but an apple tree doesn't all of a sudden produce carrots. And adult frogs give birth to baby frogs and not baby kangaroos. There simply isn't anywhere close to the kind of proof that we've been led to believe about cross-species evolution. Within species, yes, but that's adaptation. That's microevolution. Macroevolution is a different thing. Macroevolution involves complex changes across species and theories about the origins of the universe. So microevolution, I think a better term for it would be adaptation. To look at microevolution or adaptation and say that proves macroevolution, it simply doesn't make any sense. It doesn't work that way. So again, before we move on to that, microevolution is about small changes within species, adaptation. Macroevolution is about one species changing to become another species and the origins of the universe itself. And you can't use one to explain the other. They don't have that much of the Venn diagram between the two doesn't have that much of an overlap. Or in other words, you can't use microevolution to prove macroevolution. They're just too different. Do they have some overlap? Yes, but not much. Using the proof of microevolution, adaptation within species, to prove macroevolution, that is the origins of the universe, or even changes from one species to another. It's like using the theory of gravity to prove that flight is impossible. Theoretically, we should not be able to fly until all of a sudden we see a bird and we go, okay, then we're not fully understanding gravitation. And when we understand gravitation and wind resistance and all kinds of other things, and we go, oh, okay, flight is possible. We got to put it all together. But our experience pushes us to understand those things. So, yes, there is mutation within species, but an Irish setter interbreeding to become a golden retriever is not the same as a fish becoming a bird. Microevolution does not prove macroevolution. So when we as Christians have a problem with evolution, we don't have a problem with micro, which is adaptation within species. Our challenge and our pushback, and where we're still working on reconciliation, is about macro, on the macro level, on the interspecies level. Now, so the macro is one challenge. Secondly, I trust and believe in science. We all do, quite frankly. You're watching me because of science. You took an aspirin at some point because of science. Because of science, when we buy something prepackaged at the store, we don't have to boil it to pieces in order to get rid of the germs, because we trust that somebody along the way knew how to get rid of that for us. And so we just pick up a candy bar and eat it without worrying about it. Okay. Science has given us all of that, and I'm profoundly grateful for it. So, I mean, the question might be that, okay, so if I trust science for all those other things, why do we have a challenge with where science is going with this? And it's not because, oh, I don't want evolution to be true, so I'm going to figure out a way. No. On this point right now, we have limited understanding. And right now, our best understanding of creation in the Bible and our best understanding of how things came about scientifically, our best understanding of those two things do not match up. They don't. So we need to do better theology and better science for them to become best friends. But right now, because these questions are so huge and so big and so far beyond our current perception, there are parts where we just have to look at it and go, I don't see how they reconcile. So I'm going to admit that right up front. I do not fully see how the biblical account of creation and our scientific understanding of the origins of the universe, I do not see how they match up. I know that when we fully understand both of them, we will see them matching up, but we're not there yet. And so, do I doubt that what science has found is not true, or that anybody's trying to deceive me with it? No, I think science has found the best they can, and they've interpreted it the best they can. And people way smarter than me have figured out things about the age of the universe and about, the distance that light, takes to travel from stars, and we've got light coming from stars that we know are, billions of years old. The science says that, but the Bible says thousands of years. How do we reconcile the two? Quite frankly, I don't know. We'll actually get into a little bit of that next week when we talk about what does the Bible mean when it talks about days. Does it mean 24-hour days, or does it mean eras of macro history? And we'll take a look at some of that, some of the mystery around that, and some of the explanations that have been offered about that. But right now, we simply don't have an agreement between the two. It doesn't mean they won't ever agree. It means we don't have enough understanding of one or both of them to fully come to an understanding yet. That's all. But let me take a look at a handful of things about it. First of all, you can't use, like I said already, you can't use microevolution to prove macroevolution. And why is that? Well, because as we started with a couple of weeks ago, science is not designed to answer the why questions. It's designed to answer the how questions. It's supposed to deal with concrete things like data and things that are available, things that are measurable, and things that are repeatable. So let's take a look at that. Macroevolution is not available, measurable, or repeatable. And in science, you have to have it. Something has to be available for you to get to it. It has to be measurable, and it has to be repeatable. And there are aspects of our understanding of the origins of the universe that are not available, many that are not measurable, and many that are not, none of them that are repeatable. We know more than we did a generation ago, and we will learn more in the next generation than we do now. But right now we have certain limitations because of the nature of science and what it's designed to do and what it's not designed to do. So we understand things around us that are available, measurable, and repeatable. We understand things like electricity. We understand things like gravitation and magnetism because they are around us. They are available. They are measurable. They are repeatable. But we don't even know a lot about what's in the depths of our own oceans. Why? Because they're not available. We can't get down there yet. Right? So there are certain things that we just can't get to. And don't even get me started on what we do and don't understand about the human mind. It's available, but it's not measurable. We're still trying to figure out how to figure out what's going on up here. I think some of the biggest breakthroughs in science are in the next couple of generations are going to be about what's in between our ears here. But what that leads to is this. There is no consistent, universally accepted evolutionary theory about the origins of life. Partially because you cannot get, they're not available, they're not measurable, they're not repeatable. Now, as we get more information by sending probes out into space and by having material that can measure the light that's coming in the distance, we will understand more. More will be available and more will be measurable, and some things can be repeated in a lab. The more we can do that, the more we will understand it. But until then, until we get more data, there's actually a lot of disagreement among science about what the data tells us. And when it comes to evolution, there is simply no consistently universally accepted evolutionary theory about the origins of life. About micro, yes, a lot of agreement. About macro, we're just beginning to understand some of this, and there's a lot of disagreement, and our minds change regularly, as it should for a good scientist. Scientists are always available for new data, and we're always updating our theories according to the new data. That's not a criticism of science. That's a compliment to science, that they're willing to change their minds when new data comes in. Absolutely. Good theologians ought to be the same way. When we gain a better understanding through science, and when we gain a better understanding through theology of what the Bible's saying, we ought to change our minds about things. As we understand God's word better, and as we understand God's creation better, we as theologians should change our minds about things too. There are some things that aren't going to change, just like there are some things about the physical universe that aren't going to change. But that doesn't mean that we're not available to be changed as new data comes in and as we gain greater understanding of what God has given us. So, for instance, this idea of evolutionary theory, it's often presented as just like oh, evolution just is, right? And yeah, there's a whole lot we understand about evolution that just is. But we've kind of been given the idea, and I don't know any reputable science who actually says this, but this is, for the common person like me, this is kind of the feeling that a lot of us get. So I want to tackle it from our level of understanding and not pretend to be an evolutionary scientist when I'm not. From my level of understanding and from the common talk among regular folks who hear about this, most of us have the idea that, well, Darwin came up with this evolutionary theory and every real scientist agrees with Darwin. But this isn't the case. With this idea of consistent, universally accepted, and about the origins of life, let's take a look at these three things that are on your screen right now. First of all, consistent. Over the last even just 50 to 75 years, there has been a lot of changes in evolutionary theory. From the idea of spironebula, look it up, to primordial soup, look it up. You can Google all these things now. To the idea of an eternally existing Big Bang idea, which was as recently as Carl Sagan, to now the most accepted theory is the Big Bang theory, which actually comes much closer to the biblical story than any of the previous ones did. The idea that there is a beginning to time and space and that there will be an end to time and space, that's biblical. And that's our best understanding now scientifically. So it hasn't been consistent. It has changed as it ought to with new information coming in. That's not a negative on science, that's a positive. Secondly, there's no universally accepted theory. There are many theories about, especially about macroevolution, and from everything from astronomy to interspecies thing. If you talk to 10 astronomers or 10 paleontologists, they'll give you 100 different variations on evolutionary theory. There will be certain fundamental things that they absolutely agree on, but there will be tweaks within it, just like there are among theologians, and that's fine. So it's not as universally accepted as the common person thinks. Now, this is no surprise to actual scientists. They're looking at me right now and going, well, of course not. It's not like we all disagree on the basics. I understand that. I'm coming at it from a layperson's standpoint. It is not as monolithic as the average layperson thinks. And secondly, about the origins of the universe. This is one of the reasons why it's so hard to understand, because it's not all that observable. Now, we are observing more than we could because we've now got, as I said earlier, we got equipment now that can measure the light from stars that appear to have come from billions of years ago. And we have to accept that data as it appears to be, even though at this point it doesn't agree with the Bible. And right now, in my head, I'm trying to hold the idea that science tells me that the universe is billions of years old, and the Bible is talking about a matter of thousands of years. And somewhere between those, with a better understanding of science on one end and a better understanding of what the Bible says in Genesis on the other hand, there will come agreement. But right now, they appear to be two very disagreeing fields. I think better theology and better science will come to an agreement, but right now we don't have that. So the idea of figuring out the origins of the universe, we're still at the beginning of figuring that out. So that's why at a certain point, I just have to go, I don't understand that, but I trust God. And I am going to try to be a better reader of theology and a better reader of his creation to try to reconcile those things. But in the meantime, I'm just going to have to believe that God knows better than me, even when I don't understand it. So, yeah, I trust science. I do. Every time I get in the car, every time I take an aspirin, I trust science. But I trust God more. And when I don't have an understanding, I have to lean on, even though it's beyond my understanding, I trust what God is saying. And I'm going to try to understand him better, understand the Bible better, because maybe part of my misperception about science is because of a misreading of scripture, in addition to a potential misreading of science. Okay, so there are valid doubts about evolution, even though there are certain things we do know that appear to contradict the Bible. That doesn't make the Bible untrue. And so we have to, at this point, hold those two things in conflict. And that's okay. That's okay. We're allowed to not understand stuff. It doesn't mean that God doesn't understand it. It just means that we don't understand it. So is evolution a scientific fact? It's a theory. And by theory, I want to be very careful here, because quite often Christians, we use language, we misunderstand scientific language. Theory doesn't mean it's not fact. Theory means this is their best construct right now to understand these facts. So theory doesn't mean, it just doesn't matter. No, that's, yeah, there's a lot of facts that science knows about the origins of the universe, but there's a whole bunch more that we don't. And there is right now some serious disagreement between the two. So that's question number one. It basically got to lay it on the table unanswered. Question number two, is biblical creation scientifically possible? And I'm going to tell you, by the end of this, we're going to lay a lot of it on the table with questions unanswered as well, but let's tackle some of it because they are important questions. Here are two premises to answer this question that I function with as I approach very, very difficult things. Premise number one is this: the complexity of creation requires an intelligent creator. The idea that all of the complexity of life around us happened without a creator, and the idea that the complexity of life around us had a creator, are both leaps of faith. And to me, it is a greater leap of faith to look around at this complexity and go, it all happened without a creator. That to me is a bigger leap of faith. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. To me, there has to be a creator behind it. It's the only thing that makes any sense. Does that still leave gaps and holes in my understanding? Then where did God come from? Sure. But at some point, you're going to get to the closest you can to the beginning, and you're still going to have a mystery. But then where did that come from? If you take God out of it and you go to a big bang, and you go back to all of the material in the universe existed in this tiny little spot that all of a sudden blew up, you still have the question about where did that material come from? You're always going to be left with that last question. And I'd rather be left with the question of where did God come from than where did that material come from? Because where the material came from is that God created it. That to me is a better answer, because a designer of all this makes more sense to me. But again, it's a leap of faith for both of us. It just is. So the complexity of creation, as far as my approach is and as far as the Bible understands, requires an intelligent creator. Life has to it what scientists call irreducible complexity. And irreducible complexity, to way oversimplify it, is to say that a fish can't change bit by bit into a bird without dying. If a fish is going to change into a bird, it has to happen immediately, because a half fish, half bird isn't a better fish or a better bird. It's in trouble. You can't have gills that are kind of on their way to becoming lungs. A fish has to have gills and a bird has to have lungs. You can't have a little bit of one and a little bit of the other. It will die in both environments. And so this idea of these in-between steps that happen over millions of years, there's an irreducible complexity to the way things are. You cannot reduce the complexity of a human being or a fish or a bird and change it too much without killing it. So Darwin, who started this whole evolutionary theory and who, quite frankly, gave us a whole bunch of advancements in science, a whole bunch of good things have been built upon him. I'm not a one who demonizes Darwin. He was looking for answers, and he found the best answers he could come up with at the time. But Darwin believed that life was very basic and very simple. For instance, he believed in spontaneous generation, that life could just come out of nowhere, which most people in his time did. Like when they did experiments where they put meat under glass and then removed everything so that that meat was in a vacuum, and maggots still developed. And so they believed, well, life just comes out of nowhere, even in a vacuum. What they didn't understand was that the eggs for the maggots were already in the meat before they put it under glass and the vacuum. So, those kinds of things. But he believed that life could just pop up out of nowhere. And if he had any idea about the complexity of even basic biological organisms, he would have had a hard time proposing the evolutionary theory that he proposed. Nevertheless, he still, like I said, he was a smart guy who came up with some smart ideas, some of which have been disproved, some of which have been built upon. Again, I'm not going to demonize Darwin. Some right, some wrong. Okay, altogether. But once it was proven that Darwin's simple approach to life, that it was really, really simple, turned out to be much, much more complex. What evolutionary scientists did was they added the factor of time. And so while fish can't become birds within, a few hundred or a few thousand years, if you go over millions and millions and millions of years, then all of a sudden it comes across to me like a magic pill, like, oh, anything can happen. And for years ago, there was this illustration of if you put a million monkeys at a million typewriters and they type for a million years, they'd end up typing out the encyclopedia. No, if you put millions of monkeys at millions of computers over millions of years, you'll end up with billions of pages of nonsense. It doesn't get better. You just have more chaos. And that is, again, why I believe there has to be a designer, because everything we see, if you do things, no matter how often you do them, if you do them without a design, it just creates more chaos. It doesn't create order. It just doesn't. Order does not come out of chaos, no matter how much time you give it. Just not the way reality works. So the first answer to the question is that the complexity of creation requires an intelligent creator. And the second, not really answer, but kind of approach that I take to the answering this question, is that biblical creation matches scientific fact about what's required for life to begin, certainly more than any other ancient theory did, and really surprising compared to what we know now. And we'll see that next week when we look at the days of creation. As I say, there are things that science and the Bible agree on, things that we haven't yet figured out how they agree yet. But as we'll see next week, there is far more sense to the biblical account of creation matching science than any other account of creation, certainly more than any other ancient account of creation. So that's it for this week. Next week, we are going to take a look at the first 5 days of creation. We're going to take a look at what does a day mean. That's a big part of it. And a lot of theologians disagree on that. So we'll talk about what a day means. And we'll talk about, is there such a thing as evolutionary creationism where they come together? Can you be biblical and have that? And what about things like intelligent design theory and so on? So yeah, we're going to look at a lot of stuff next week. It's big, it's challenging, it's thought-provoking. A lot of it leaves more questions than answers, but it's important for us to consider. And we as Christians cannot be afraid of asking questions even when we don't necessarily have answers yet, because just because I don't know doesn't mean that God doesn't know. And if we don't open up ourselves to the questions, we'll never arrive at the answers. So some of it is just going to be the asking of questions and waiting for the answers, but we're going to ask the questions. I hope you'll stick with me as we go through it. Genesis, all of chapter 1, or almost all of chapter 1 next week. We'll see you then.